essa daí azul, da outra vez que o reitor veio, que a gente tem a garrafinha em cima da mesa.
Digital e Culturas do Contemporâneo. Estamos muito felizes de receber aqui esse congresso, esse segundo congresso, dessa rede recém-formada, mas já tão viva e tão rica. Então, eu vou começar a passar a palavra aqui para os meus colegas, a quem agradeço terem comparecido. Também faço uma nota que o presidente da Câmara de Faro, que estava convidado para essa sessão e tinha confirmado a presença, teve um imprevisto ontem à noite e avisou que não poderia estar presente, mas desejou um ótimo congresso a todos os participantes. Sendo assim, eu começo, então, passando a palavra para a professora Manuel Baptista, da Universidade de Aveiro, que é a presidente da RNEC, da Rede Nacional de Estudos Culturais.
Então, muito bom dia a todos e todas. Em primeiro lugar, começo por agradecer, obviamente, à Universidade do Algarve e à organização, obviamente, aqui da professora Gabriela, e também na pessoa da professora Mirian Tavares, coordenadora do CIAC. Cumprimento também o senhor Vice-Reitor da ESEC, professor Doutor Pedro Calado, e o Sr. Vice-Reitor para a Investigação e Cultura da Universidade do Algarve, o professor Doutor Nuno Bicho. Muito obrigada a todos por estarem aqui logo de manhãzinha, tão cedo, não é? Para mim é um grande prazer estar pela primeira vez na Universidade do Algarve. Já tenho trabalhado bastante com esta universidade, mas de facto é a primeira vez que estou aqui fisicamente. E vou-vos falar só um bocadinho da nossa rede nacional. A Rede Nacional em Estudos Culturais articula hoje 12 instituições portuguesas de investigação e docência de nível superior, dedicadas ao desenvolvimento de ações de investigação, inovação, formação e difusão dos estudos culturais. De facto, na última década, o campo dos estudos culturais em Portugal tem-se desenvolvido consideravelmente no que diz respeito ao ensino, sobretudo com o aumento do número de programas doutorais, e à investigação. Este desenvolvimento também se revela no crescente número de congressos em estudos culturais, de entre outros exemplos, vejam-se já os 8 congressos internacionais realizados pelo CLLC na Universidade de Aveiro, de publicações, destacando-se diversos livros, como de estudos de género, da revista lusófona em estudos culturais. Para além disso, as grandes linhas temáticas que os estudos culturais têm desenvolvido nacionalmente são artes, género, performance, comunicação, estudos pós-coloniais, ativismos, ócio, lazer, indústrias culturais, globalização, identidades e movimentos migratórios. Trata-se, como todos sabemos, de uma área fortemente interdisciplinar, atravessada por um intenso debate teórico, do qual eu penso que iremos, de alguma forma, fazer eco aqui nestes 2 dias. A ideia é essa, é esse debate interdisciplinar, e que, simultaneamente, tem uma atenção particular ao contexto concreto e empírico, por se articular com as práticas atuais das sociedades contemporâneas enraizadas na sua própria história. Por ser uma área ainda recente em Portugal, por vezes a investigação encontra-se fragmentada e mesmo pouco visível. E daí a ideia de criar uma rede nacional em estudos culturais, esta RNEC, que aqui se encontra, hoje e amanhã fará aqui também a sua reunião anual, que se destina a promover a estruturação do campo e a estimular a cooperação nacional, de forma a conferir maior robustez à produção científica na área, bem como a divulgá-la através da articulação com outras redes nacionais e internacionais. De facto, com esta iniciativa, pretende-se tornar os estudos culturais praticados nas universidades portuguesas cada vez mais uma referência dentro e fora do país. Bom, o primeiro congresso da RNEC decorreu em Aveiro, sob a temática Cartografias, Desafios e Possibilidades. Aqui sabemos que se trata da Cidadania Digital e Culturas do Contemporâneo, não podíamos estar mais dentro dos estudos culturais. Esse primeiro congresso foi organizado pela RNEC e pelo Centro de Línguas, Literaturas e Culturas da Universidade de Aveiro, decorreu nos dias 26 e 27 de maio de 2022 na Universidade de Aveiro e pretendeu reunir pela primeira vez académicos, investigadores e centros de investigação, bem como instituições académicas portuguesas que se têm dedicado nas últimas 2 décadas aos estudos culturais e de cultura. Tratando-se de uma comunidade que se tem expandido e desenvolvido de forma assinalável ao longo dos últimos anos em Portugal, já com 28 centros de investigação e 153 cursos de todos os níveis, espalhados por todas as instituições do ensino superior em Portugal. Nós fizemos o levantamento de 51 licenciaturas que têm esta área como uma área importante, 54 cursos de mestrado, 37 de doutoramento e 11 pós-graduações entre 98 e 2020. Este segundo congresso visa, então, promover o reconhecimento desta comunidade académica e potenciar redes de ensino e investigação mais articuladas e densas. No que concerne ao universo da Rede Nacional de Estudos Culturais, ela representa hoje 12 universidades, mais de 250 investigadores integrados, 170 investigadores em formação e mais de 3.400 alunos admitidos e pelo menos 1.600 alunos já diplomados no campo. O primeiro Congresso Nacional teve como objetivo mapear a área em Portugal e tivemos em Aveiro todas as instituições universitárias e de ensino politécnico que, de facto, estão articuladas com os estudos culturais e, neste segundo congresso, pretendemos, então, debater o mais aprofundadamente a questão dos estudos culturais em Portugal, do que fazemos, do que nos interessa e articular-nos em rede. E, portanto, a todos desejo um bom congresso e, de novo, muito obrigada por toda a equipa que esteve e estará durante estes 2 dias envolvida na sua organização. Uma organização primorosa, não é? Já temos o livro de resumos pronto e quero-vos também dizer que iremos lançar o livro do primeiro congresso, ou seja, trouxemos uns cartõezinhos com QR Code e podem ter acesso já ao livro que resume os textos que foram apresentados e as comunicações apresentadas o ano passado em Aveiro. Um bom congresso para todos e muito obrigada pelo acolhimento.
Agora eu passo a palavra à professora Mirian Tavares, coordenadora do CIAC, Centro de Investigação em Artes e Comunicação, da Universidade do Algarve.
Bom dia. Queria começar por cumprimentar os meus companheiros e companheiras de mesa, começando pela colega e, no fundo, fundadora, criadora, a pessoa que mexeu e fez com que isso acontecesse, a professora Manuel Baptista, que, de fato, sem ela não estaríamos aqui. Tem sido essa força motriz muito bem escudada por vários investigadores que trabalham com ela e outros colegas de outras instituições, mas foi realmente uma ideia muito bem-vinda e veio numa ótima altura, porque, de fato, os estudos nessa área têm se expandido pelo país, mas estavam completamente dispersos. E foi por isso, de fato, que quando o professor Pedro Ferrer, que foi a primeira pessoa a ser contactada pela professora Maria Manuel, perguntou se o CIAC teria interesse em aderir à rede, eu imediatamente disse que sim, e, dentro das muitas funções que nós temos no centro, a nossa partilha de várias possibilidades de trabalho, como a professora Gabriela Borges era a pessoa que, de fato, tem trabalhado há mais tempo nessa área, eu pedi que ela representasse o CIAC na rede, mas, de fato, o CIAC, como um todo, pertence à rede e, para nós, é uma honra e um prazer muito grande estarmos aqui hoje a sediar o segundo congresso. Queria também agradecer, de modo muito especial, à ESEC, aqui representada pelo senhor vice-diretor, o meu colega, o Pedro Calado, que foi, desde primeira hora, uma parceira que ajudou e tornou, de fato, também possível que isso pudesse se realizar. Nós sabemos que realizar um congresso é sempre uma tarefa muito complexa e as instituições, de facto, por mais que tentem nos ajudar, têm tantas outras funções que, às vezes, se torna difícil estabelecer parcerias, mas, de fato, com a ESEC isso correu lindamente tem sido um apoio fundamental, como também tem sido da reitoria, aqui também representado pelo meu colega e querido amigo professor Nuno Bicho, que não só é representante da área da investigação na universidade, mas que também e conhece muito bem a área, porque dirige um dos centros mais importantes que nós temos aqui, que tem investido imenso naquilo que é a verdadeira investigação e a produção de novos investigadores e de novas pessoas que bem precisamos para trabalhar nas nossas universidades, para dar uma nova energia, que nós estamos já ficando um bocadinho velhos e cansados, e, portanto, é bom ter sangue novo. Enfim, os 90 são os novos 50, mas tudo bem, a gente já está assim numa fase. Dito isso, queria, então, só dizer que o CIAC, de fato, o Centro de Investigação em Artes e Comunicação, tem sido, desde o princípio, não de forma explícita, mas de forma implícita e de forma ativa, é um centro que tem trabalhado nas diversas áreas dos estudos culturais, através das diversas literacias que desenvolvemos, através de projetos mais específicos, quer nas áreas do gênero. Mais recentemente, temos integrado também projetos na área da migração, cidadania, e as cidadanias digitais o lugar onde nos encontramos nesse momento, todos nós, e é um espaço em que o CIAC tem atuado bastante, desde há mais de 10 anos, a criação de um doutoramento em Média e Arte Digital, que tem não só como função trabalhar as questões mais específicas do digital, mas, sobretudo, as questões de cidadania e de literacia que são levantadas a partir dessas novas realidades na qual estamos todos imersos. Portanto, fico muito contente que nós tenhamos sido escolhidos para realizar aqui esse segundo congresso, dizer que o CIAC apoia e que faz parte, aliás, eu estou também como um dos membros fundadores da Rede Internacional de Estudos Culturais, que tem promovido, enfim, uma relação profunda, e existe também em perfeita ligação com a Rede Nacional de Estudos Culturais, e, por isso, para nós é um grande prazer estarmos hoje aqui, começando esse congresso. E, só para terminar, para não me alongar muito, eu devo dizer que uma das coisas que mais me deixa feliz é ver essa sala cheia. Hoje em dia, a maior parte dos congressos são aqueles congressos em que nós vamos debitar o nosso conhecimento e sabedoria e vamos embora. E eu tenho certeza que isso não vai acontecer aqui, porque as pessoas que estão aqui, pelas comunicações que eu vi, pelos resumos, são pessoas que estão profundamente empenhadas naquilo que fazem, no fundo, e, por isso, eu tenho certeza que vamos ter 2 dias muito intensos, de muita troca, que é isso que importa e que é isso que realmente faz com que nós nos desloquemos dos nossos lugares para estarmos hoje aqui, durante 2 dias, a conversar, a nos conhecer melhor e também a ajudar a desenvolver mais essa área dos estudos culturais em Portugal. Portanto, sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Muito obrigada à professora Gabriela Borges e a toda a equipe do CIAC e da ESEC que colaborou na realização desse evento, na possibilidade desse acontecimento, e muito obrigada a todos que estão aqui na mesa pelo apoio imenso que deram também por esse dia de hoje. Portanto, só tenho a desejar um ótimo congresso a todos vocês. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada. Agora eu passo a palavra, então, ao professor Pedro Calado, vice-diretor da Escola Superior de Educação e Comunicação da Universidade do Algarve.
Bom dia a todos. Vou-me desculpar um pouco, digamos, o facto de ter um discurso curto, fui apanhado um bocado a contrapé. Não era suposto estar cá a outra pessoa, mas não é por isso que vamos deixar de, primeiro, dar as boas-vindas a todos os presentes, agradecer as palavras que foram ditas, sobretudo aqui pela colega Mirian Tavares, e enfatizar realmente o facto de que também estou surpreendido pela quantidade de gente presente, o que acho que é um bom sinal nos dias que vão correndo, e numa época em que cada vez mais as nossas atividades são mediadas através de mídias digitais, que nem de propósito, e ainda agradecer o esforço desenvolvido por todos os docentes e alunos do mestrado em Comunicação e Médias Digitais da ESEC, e sobretudo na pessoa da professora Gabriela Borges, que permitiram e possibilitaram que isto estivesse a acontecer aqui hoje. Portanto, a todos desejo as boas-vindas, espero que os trabalhos decorram da melhor forma e agradeço a vossa presença. Obrigado.
Obrigado. Agora eu passo a palavra ao professor Nuno Bicho, que é vice-reitor para Investigação e Cultura da Universidade do Algarve.
Olá, bom dia a todos e a todos. Quero começar por cumprimentar os meus colegas de mesa, a senhora Presidente da RNEC, a professora Manuel Baptista, o senhor Subdiretor da ESEC, aqui ao meu lado direito, o professor Pedro Calado, a senhora Diretora do CIAC, minha caríssima colega e amiga Mirian Tavares, e, por fim, a professora Gabriela Borges, como, enfim, o elemento principal na organização deste evento. Quero cumprimentar todos os presentes, naturalmente. Devo dizer que é um enorme prazer estar hoje aqui a representar a Universidade do Algarve em nome do Sr. Reitor, professor Paulo Águas. Quero dar oficialmente as boas-vindas a todos os presentes. Não sei se estamos a ver a ser seguidos remotamente e, portanto, àqueles que aqui estão e aos outros que estão de lá à distância. Naturalmente, e como seria de esperar, dei uma olhadela no programa do 2º Congresso da Rede Nacional de Estudos Culturais, este ano sobre o tema Cidadania Digital e Culturas do Contemporâneo. O programa é impressionante, devo dizer, com perto ou mais de 40 intervenções sobre os temas mais variados, no âmbito de 6 sessões, a que se junta depois, no final, uma sessão de apresentação de livros ou de publicações, penso que é assim a designação. Não teremos todas as instituições de ensino superior de Portugal, mas temos muitas, com toda a certeza, e juntam-se a isso colegas, penso eu, do Brasil, de Espanha e de Itália. E, portanto, dá um verdadeiro cunho internacional e científico a este congresso, como, aliás, seria de esperar. E, naturalmente, enquanto vice-reitor para a investigação e para a cultura da Universidade do Algarve, isso enche-me de orgulho e de honra estar aqui. Quero, enfim, agradecer este trabalho. Pensei em dizer algumas palavras sobre o tema do evento, a cidadania digital e culturas do contemporâneo, mas, de facto, tudo quanto eu pudesse dizer não se compararia nunca àquilo que serão os próximos 2 dias. E, portanto, prefiro estar calado e dar o espaço aos especialistas, não vos incomodando mais e falando também pouco, que é para não dizer muitas asneiras, no meu caso, não é? E agradecer, sem dúvida nenhuma, mais uma vez à RNEC, ao CIAC e à organização deste evento com este tema em particular. Muito obrigado. Quero, por fim, desejar bons trabalhos durante estes 2 dias a todos os presentes e que isto vos seja particularmente útil e agradável, naturalmente. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Nuno Bicho. Algumas notas a respeito da organização do Congresso. Como vocês podem, né, já ter percebido pelo programa, vamos ter 3 palestras principais, né, com os nossos oradores convidados, a quem eu muito agradeço terem aceito a vinda, né, até a Universidade do Algarve. Teremos também uma mesa que a gente chamou de Mesa RNEC, né, que são com 3 investigadores portugueses que têm trabalhado nessa área dos estudos culturais, e a gente pensou, né, num formato para esse congresso, no sentido de valorizar também o que vem sendo produzido, né, dentro da própria rede. Depois temos os painéis temáticos que foram propostos por alguns membros da RNEC, juntamente com os seus orientandos ou os seus colegas de universidade ou de centro de investigação, e temos as sessões temáticas, né, que são mais numerosas, que são os trabalhos de doutorandos, e investigadores e docentes em diversas áreas, como vocês podem perceber. O que eu gostaria de... e teremos também uma mesa de apresentação de publicações, em que nós convidamos o professor Inácio Aguaded para falar da revista Comunicar, que é uma revista, uma das principais revistas do mundo na área dos estudos culturais. Temos a apresentação do livro da RNEC, como a professora Manuel colocou, e também uma publicação recente, a última publicação do CIAC, que também é nesse campo da cidadania digital. O que nós também gostaríamos de ter em atenção, já mandei e-mails para todos, mas eu vou reforçar, gostaríamos de pedir que todos os colegas, participantes com comunicação, respeitassem o tempo de fala, porque, como vocês podem perceber, temos mais de 60. O professor Nuno falou por volta de 40, mas são mais de 60. Então, são muitas apresentações, o que é um sucesso, todas as apresentações, todas as comunicações foram recebidas, passaram por 2 revisores, então, acho que a gente vai ter apresentações com muita qualidade. E também esperamos que vocês nos enviem os textos completos até 31 de agosto, que é para a gente poder organizar o livro do próximo congresso. E convido também para, no final do dia, depois das 6 horas, que a gente vai estar acabando aqui às 6 horas, convido a todos para uma inauguração de uma exposição de arte de um colega nosso, professor do curso de Artes Visuais e também um artista plástico muito renomado em Portugal, chamado Xana, alguns de vocês devem conhecer, que vai acontecer na Galeria Trem, que é uma galeria da Câmara Municipal de Faro, em parceria, que trabalha em parceria com o curso de Artes Visuais, e vai acontecer hoje às 6 horas. Chama-se Passagens, essa exposição. E é do lado da tertúlia Algarvia, onde a gente vai ter o jantar hoje às 20h30. Então, assim, fica o convite para quem quiser ir conhecer o centro, a cidade velha, de Faro, passear ali um bocadinho, como dizem bem os portugueses, e depois irem ao jantar. Agradeço, então, a todos. Tenham um bom evento. Obrigada. Você já fica aqui.
Should I put it? No. Should I put it here? You don't take it? Okay, I can just shoot it from the key. Yeah. The first one. No? No. We are online, right? I can show a video from online on YouTube. Okay. No, there is just a link. Link. As they don't see this. They don't see this. No, but it's interesting. We can even, so in this way, what I see here is one thing, and what they see there is another thing. So, you have across on every day. Okay. I got it. So, it's not a big deal. I can even not too sure. No. Yeah. You put here the notes. Annotate or extend it. Okay, in this way, what I see here is the same, right? Okay, let me try. Thank you. The audio is here, right? Okay. Perfect.
Então, penso que já estamos... Está tudo preparado para começarmos aqui a primeira conferência. Eu vou falar um bocadinho em português e depois um bocadinho também em inglês e depois outra vez um bocadinho em português. Is that okay?
Almost.
So I'm saying I'm going to talk a little bit in Portuguese, a little bit in English, and then to give you the...
If you want in Italian.
Italian, no, it's not possible for me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, então, vamos começar a primeira conferência. Eu vou fazer uma apresentação muito breve. I want to thank Professor Marco to come to Algarve and to the University of Algarve. We didn't meet before 10 minutes ago. We just met through Zoom in an organization of an international congress about what is or what's about cultural studies or something like that. And it was a pleasure to meet him by Zoom. We had many meetings. And it was a very interesting connection. So I proposed Professor Marco to come here, and Professora Gabriela made it possible, and the University of Algarve. Thank you very much. And I'm going to present you now in Portuguese. I'm sorry, but... Então, o professor é Marco Solaroli, da Universidade de Bolonha. É professor associado de Sociologia Cultural e Comunicação no Departamento de Artes da Universidade de Bolonha. Estudou na Universidade de Bolonha, na Universidade de Milão e na Universidade da Pensilvânia, tendo sido investigador Fulbright na Universidade de Nova Iorque. Os seus interesses de investigação consistem na interseção da sociologia cultural, dos estudos culturais e dos estudos da cultura visual. Mais recentemente, coeditou a edição especial da revista italiana de estudos culturais, Studi Culturali, em 2022, intitulado Cultural Studies Today, Identities, Intersections, Challenges. E coorganizou, lá está, onde eu estava também, a Conferência Internacional What's Happening to Cultural Studies, que decorreu em 2022 na Universidade de Brighton. O título da conferência será Estudos Culturais e Cidadania Visual e, segundo a informação que tenho, falará entre 20 e 30 minutos e depois teremos 15 minutos de debate. So you have between 20 and 30 minutes and then we will talk for 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Please, if you can remember me about the time, because I tend to speak sometimes a little bit more than I am expected to, but thank you. Buongiorno. Thank you so much, Manuel. Please let me thank you, Gabriela, Borges, and the other organizers for inviting me to this conference. I'm very grateful and glad to be here. not just to present my own work, but also, and more widely, some of the work that's been carried out in Italy in the field of cultural studies over the last decade, but also, and I would say mainly, as an occasion for intellectual dialogue and professional networking. We sometimes tend to take networking for granted as a part of our job as academics, but I think that networking is a very central dimension, especially in the field of cultural studies, which, as you know, is a field so heterogeneous, often contested, surely interdisciplinary, and somehow in constant need of self-reflexivity. So let me start from a very brief intellectual biography, very briefly. I speak from the position of a scholar which has been involved in the field of cultural studies in Italy for the last 15 years or so. However, as Manuel just said, my formal academic houses are in the disciplines of sociology of culture and communication. In other words, I consider cultural studies in part as a professional field of academic practice, but also, and I would say especially, as a research object to be studied, not just to be practices. My involvement, as Manuel was just saying, my involvement in the field of cultural studies has been taking shape mainly through the collective work developed within this journal, the Italian Journal of Cultural Studies in Italy, which was founded in 2004, so almost 20 years ago. A very strongly interdisciplinary journal, which somehow established itself quite relevantly in the academic field in Italy over the last 2 decades. Last year, together with a colleague of mine, Cristina De Maria from the University of Bologna, a semiotician from the so-called Umberto Eco School of Semiotics in Bologna, we edited the special issue in which we try to identify some of the major trends shaping the field of cultural studies, both in Italy and at the international level. Of course, that was an ambitious, probably too much task, a difficult one, but I think a very necessary one. Here you can see the cover. In the collective work, we try to present some of the major trends affecting cultural studies, and some of the material I'll be presenting today come from that special issue. As Manuel was already saying right now, what I'd like to stress now is that such a task of defining and redefining the field is not a new task at all in the field of cultural studies. Indeed, cultural studies seems to have the very frequent necessity of defining and redefining itself. That necessity was also the basis of this international conference organized last year, but it can be found also in many recent scholarly projects. Just take a look at the series of papers published over the last 2 years in the International Journal of Cultural Studies, and trying indeed to answer the question, what is cultural studies and where cultural studies is nowadays. We have seen these instances, these needs and these questions over and over the years, over the last 2 decades. And they speak of the uncertain hybrid, or maybe perhaps the dynamic and challenging nature of this field of study, of the original formation of cultural studies in Britain and of its evolution over time in many different countries. But nowadays, I think that we keep seeing these tensions, these questions, not just because of the nature of the cultural studies project, but because we live in complex societies in which cultural studies, quite paradoxically, are deeply necessary as much as deeply in crisis. And that's of course a very good reason, I think, for doing research and work in this field of studies nowadays. In a recent paper, Nick Coldry has suggested, in a paper published in this journal, Nick Coldry has suggested 3 major sources of crisis for culture and politics and cultural studies nowadays. First, the deeply practical and deeply ideological challenges to democracy, which are very visible in a variety of countries throughout the world. Second, the conservative attempts to reverse at least half a century of reforms, of social, political, and cultural reforms. And third, the so-called corporate drive, which clearly invests also the academic field and also the transformation of society by processes of increasing platformization and datafication. Another element of challenge to cultural studies surely deals with the increase and fragmentation over the last 2 decades of a number of subfields of so many different studies that we can find in the academic world nowadays, from media studies to gender studies to visual studies to memory studies and so many others, science, technology, and so on, digital culture. So I'm not going to offer any answer to the question of the contemporary identity of cultural studies today, but I'd like to suggest one way among many possible ones that might hopefully turn out to be productive in addressing these tensions. In a somehow self-reflective fashion, I'd like to propose that we need to promote empirical research about the concrete institutional and professional conditions of practice of cultural studies. And we need to do that by identify and segment the wide cultural studies field in a variety of more or less specific areas of inquiry, fields and subfields which have acquired increased legitimation in the academic world over the last 2 decades and whose analysis could help shedding some lights on the wider field of cultural studies. So today I speak about the field of visual culture studies, visual studies, as we will see, it can be named in different ways with different shades of meaning, and its relation to cultural studies. And I will do this somehow as a prism through which to address wider tensions of cultural studies and some of the ongoing transformations and challenges to contemporary cultures. My speech is structured into 3 main parts. In the first one, I will show some empirical research of an analysis of the field of scholarly journals of cultural studies. In other words, I suggest that focusing on what gets published and where it gets published, it's a useful starting point for every debate about the identity and boundaries of the field of cultural studies. I know there will be another speech on this in this conference, and I'm looking forward to hearing that. Secondly, I'll focus on the academic institutionalization of the field of visual cultural studies over the last 2 decades by looking in particular at the journals of visual cultural studies. And finally, just if time permits it, I'll offer a brief analysis of a case study dealing with visual citizenship, political power, and cultural hegemony in Italy, in contemporary Italy. So, in this graph presents some empirical material collected by 2 colleagues of mine, Marco Santoro and Matteo Gerli, in Italy, and published in the special issue I was telling you about last year. Here, as you can see, this graph presents some bibliographical evidence drawn from the Web of Science database and referring to 45 journals belonging and classified as belonging in this database to the subject area cultural studies, with impact factor for a total of almost 43,000 articles published in the field of cultural studies over the last 25 years. As you can see better here, the number of scholarly journals of cultural studies strongly grew, especially since the second half of the first decade of this century. And in particular, they grew through 2 major temporal phases. In the second half of the first decade of this century, from 2005 to 2010, and then in the last decade, from 2010 to 2020. In both of these 2 phases, the number of papers published in the field of cultural studies doubled. Here, you can see a factorial plan which shows the major themes or thematic categories in the field of cultural studies and the major disciplinary areas, so from the field of cultural studies to the field of social science to the field of the humanities. Clearly, this is the result of an analysis of the paper, of an analysis of topic modeling of the title, the abstract, and the text of the paper published in these journals, so only 45 journals, but quite relevant journals. And you can see the major areas of research of the field, of the international field of cultural studies. and somehow they can be considered as somehow thematic clusters. So you can see on the left, upper left, material culture, everyday life, subjectivity, capitalism. On the right, upper right, literature and criticism, film and television and media studies, I would say. On the bottom left, communication, digital media, consumption, and culture and creative industries. And on the bottom right, post-colonialism and history and memory studies. So here you see the acronyms of the journals, of the 45 journals I'm talking about, and where they can be positioned among these different thematic categories. So we'll find in the center and in the more central and prestigious positions many very well-known journals, Cultural Studies, International Journal of Cultural Studies, Theory, Culture and Society, and others. But we also see some more recent journals. Some of the journals founded in the 90s or at the beginning of this century and contributing to the growth of the papers in the field of cultural studies. For example, the Journal of Visual Culture that you can see right here. Okay. So the overall scenario looks quite crowded today, and such a growth of scholarly journals can be explained, I think, not just by looking at the field as a generic whole, but by segmenting, indeed, the field and analyzing the process of increasing institutionalization and somehow academic success of a variety of more specialized subfields. So today, I will talk about the field of visual culture and its relationship with the wider field of cultural studies and also with other disciplines and intellectual traditions working and growing on the borders of the field and carving out new spaces. Visual culture today identifies a field, a transdisciplinary international field which has been strongly expanded and institutionalized over the last 2 decades. The definition itself of the field represents one of the most debated issue, and which is clearly a symptom of a very pre-paradigmatic epistemological status, if you want, and a very huge variety of different heterogeneous positions within it. So sometimes in a very similar way to the wider field of cultural studies. If today we talk about visual culture, visual studies, Kulturvisuell, Bildwissenschaft, or visual research methods, just to give you some ideas of the different labels that you can find in this field of study, we actually talk about somehow very different orientations, different authors, different theories, and even different methods, all belonging to the same widely defined field of visual cultural studies, but somehow representing orientations and even authors that don't even talk each other. Since the beginning of the century, we have seen a number of debates trying to define this field of study, its epistemological and methodological status, and in this process, over the last 2 decades, the historical role and the contemporary legacy of cultural studies as a field, in particular of British cultural studies, somehow tend to represent a very hotly debated issue, since some authors and journals and theories clearly belong to that tradition, but some other clearly come from many other different disciplines, even beyond cultural studies, especially from art history, from semiotics, from literature, and from many other disciplines in the field of cultural studies, of the social sciences, and the humanities. So it's interesting to observe how in the same year, in 2002, so exactly 21 years ago, 3 major journals were founded in the same year. The Journal of Visual Culture, that I just talked about, Visual Communication and Visual Studies. Actually, Visual Studies was the new name given to an older journal, the Visual Sociology Journal, which was already existing for 16 years, and in that year it changed name, somehow showing a wider interdisciplinary interest. These 3 journals, among many others, represents, I would say, some of the major orientations of this field of study. So the Journal of Visual Culture being positioned closer to the field of the humanities and the theoretical reflection, the Visual Studies Journal being positioned closer to the field of social sciences, sociology, anthropology, and methodological debates, and Visual Communication clearly closer to the field of media and communication, and often with some more socio-semiotic approach. So, even if, as I just said, we often find very different and sometimes contesting orientations in this field of study, there can be, I think, no doubts about the relevance that cultural studies, particularly British cultural studies, and particularly the work done by Stuart Hall, have played in this, in the emergence and increasing success of this field of studies over the years. Already in the second half of the 90s, Stuart Hall edited and published two major books, Visual Representation, which is probably one of the well-known, most important books in the field of media and cultural studies, published in the 90s, which actually is a work about visual representation mainly. And the Reader that Stuart Hall edited with Jessica Evans at the end of the 90s, that I don't hesitate to define as one of the very first genealogical reconstruction of some founding epistemological categories of visual culture. So we see a lot of work, a lot of publishing, a lot of theoretical reflection done by one of the major founding authors in the field of British cultural studies before the emergence and institutionalization of the field of studies of visual culture. And this clearly speaks about the relevance of this work in shaping the orientation of this field of studies, and also of entering in debates with other very different orientations, similarly interested to issues of visual culture. More recently, last year, a very interesting book came out, edited by Charlotte Bransdon, one of the founding figures of the School of Cultural Studies from Birmingham, in which she reconstructs the role played by Stuart Hall in the field of media studies, and particularly in the field of visual media studies. In other words, in this book you can find a number of more or less shorter or longer pieces written by Stuart Hall about visual culture, visual media, and visual representation since the very beginning of its work. So this is very interesting, I think, because it shows the work of conceptualization and visual analysis done by Stuart Hall since the early 70s and not just the late 90s. And so this speaks of a very seminal, pioneering visual sensibility, which was at the core of the work done by cultural studies, by the Cultural Studies Project since its very beginning. But such an intellectual biography, such an intellectual trajectory, has been only marginally recognized over the last 2 decades in the increasingly institutionalized academic field of visual culture studies. In this book, you will find some very well-known pieces, encoding, decoding, and others, and some less known pieces written by Stuart Hall, for example, about news photography, or the role of photography in representing ethnic identities, and so on. So you'll find some of the work done by Stuart Hall as an academic, but also some of the work done by Stuart Hall as a public intellectual. As you know, Stuart Hall was very much involved in public debates and political debates in UK, and not only in UK, but he was also very much involved in the professional field of visual culture. He was very much in touch with a number of photographers, for example. He was the chair of the Institute of International Visual Arts in the UK, and it was also the chair of the Association of Black Photographers in the UK. So this book somehow gives back an image of Stuart Hall as a pioneering and quite innovative scholar of visual culture, much ahead of time. Talking about a that famous paper by Stuart Hall about news photographs, the determinants of news photographs, quite an influential piece which presents a visual analysis of photographies, of photographs published in major news journals and magazines in the UK. By reconstructing that paper, published in 1972 in the Working Papers of Cultural Studies, in this book, the editor of this book describes that early interest by Stuart Hall in these terms, by underlying how in that paper we find for the first time a discussion of the diverse decodifications of media messages by members of differently situated publics. These ideas were later developed in the influential paper on television, encoding and decoding. So, in other words, I think we have to recognize the specific sensibility towards the analysis of visual culture shown by Hall since its very first publications, a sensibility which was shared with other colleagues and in the School of Birmingham, from Dick Ebditch to Angie McRobbie on Paul Gilroy. Think about Paul Gilroy's books on Black Atlantic and the role of photographs of black citizens in the UK. A sensibility which was kept and somehow which grown over the years, and I think that could be revealing, be considered as somehow generating some of the concepts and models which later contributed to the success of British cultural studies. However, such a recognition, it's not largely shared and known probably nowadays. Last year, another special issue of the journal Visual Studies, called Visual Studies Today, presented a questionnaire to a huge variety of influential scholars of visual studies and visual culture internationally. And some of the very first questions of this questionnaire were indeed about the relationship between visual culture and cultural studies as a field. So just to suggest the idea that just like cultural studies as a wider field, many different subfields have encountered over the years similar problems of self-definitions. But I think this is not indeed a real problem. I think it's an opportunity for us to do research and to develop better and find toolkits to address issues of cultures and cultural studies nowadays. So we don't have to talk about strictly academic debates on definitions and redefinition of the field of study. We have to understand this debate as a prism through which we need to assess the relevance of cultural studies in the study of contemporary cultures. In that special issue I was talking about, the editor of the special issue of Visual Studies actually wrote that the legacy of Stuart Hall is largely felt today because it deals with questions, cultural and ideological questions, linked to the complexity of representation nowadays, the complexity of subjectivities, of the identity politics. And it clearly positions these issues at the very center of our understanding of visual culture. So, talking about visual citizenship from a cultural studies perspective, on this basis, clearly raises questions of visual representation, visual identity, and visual power. Talking about visual citizenship and citizenship more largely from a cultural studies perspective implies focusing on practices and strategies of representation, increasingly self-representation, even online, but also counter-representation. It implies asking not just how social groups and social identities are framed and reframed over the years in different media, but also, and most importantly, I would say, asking who gets included and who gets excluded from these processes of representation, from this picture. And clearly asking which forces shape this process. In the past, this kind of work also the work done by Stuart Hall himself, has been done by looking at major institutional context of media and political power, but today it's compulsory also to include major social media platforms as new, relevant, technological intermediaries that significantly play a role in shaping different scales of public visibility and invisibility. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the digitalization of the processes of production and consumption, of visual production and consumption, and the increasing presence of visual social media platforms in our lives have clearly challenged existing ways of seeing social practices and cultural expectations in a variety of different fields and in the wider visual public culture. The everyday circulation of networked images and the uses of visual social media platforms to communicate and share contents and experiences, in other words, to acquire and debate information, to manage and expand relationships, and to build and promote identities, very often branded identities, have been argued to constitute an increasing shift toward a more ubiquitous, conversational, and platformized character of contemporary photographs and images. We have seen this in a variety of different fields. Think about the journalistic field and the multiplication of actors and practices of production of visual news over the years, the so-called topic of citizen journalism and photojournalism, the possibility for every citizen, for everyone to produce images and share them that could have a relevance within news debates. We have seen this particularly in the first decade of this century in many different media events, in many different scandals. Think about 9/11, Abu Ghraib, the London bombings in 2005, the Arab Springs, and so many. So that phase was characterized by a sort of very emancipatory, participatory, democratic view of citizenship, of the possibilities emerging from new digital technologies for citizenship to express their voice. But indeed, over the last century, this vision has been problematized. Over the last decade, this vision has been problematized clearly because the emergence of visual social media platforms clearly speaks nowadays of issues of exploitation, of datification and exploitation of users' activities and experiences online, also for questions of control, of censorship, and especially of money making for business within the so-called platform capitalism. In the field of politics, in a similar way, these new technologies, these emerging uses of social media platforms has clearly contributed to the self-representation of political power and political leaders online. Not just through a more or less efficient use of social media, but also through the emergence and somehow success of new social rituals. Think about the selfie, which seems like a very banal social act, but in the political field, like in the journalistic field, but in the political field has played clearly a role over the last 2 decades, also to contribute to the construction of consensus, to contribute to the construction of political leaders as somehow celebrities, and citizens and voters somehow as fans of the celebrity politicians. So here you see a few pictures from a very well-known Italian politician who's been prime minister over the last few years and who's now minister of infrastructure in our very right-wing oriented government, Matteo Salvini. Matteo Salvini has been one of the very first and probably one of the best user of social media in the field of politics in Italy. He has structured a very efficient team of social media managers over the years, which have exploited some of the possibilities of social media platforms, the use of the metrics, the analysis of the sentiment online, and so on, to somehow develop a very, chameleon-like strategy, like the chameleon, the animal changing colors depending on the context. Salvini has been able to really produce an image of himself which sometimes strives to strike a balance between the ordinary man, doing what you do, like everyone else, cooking pasta or going on vacation, and the official one, the leader, okay? So the political leader with institutional responsibilities. At the same time, he was able to really develop a strategy, even a visual strategy, through which he was self-presenting himself in different ways according to the very specific social, cultural, geographical context in which he had to go and talk. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So this strongly contributed, as many political communication scholars in Italy have shown over the last few years, to the success of Salvini and to the building of his name and his online community of followers over the last few years. The practice of the selfie, as I was saying, has been surely one of the smartest way through which he was able to build an apparently ordinary, equal relationship with his own community of citizens, voters, and fans. Also producing a number of scandals, for example, when he took some selfies during a major state funeral for the tragedy of the collapse of the bridge in the city of Genoa. And during the funeral, he was taking selfies with people, and this has generated a number of debates in Italy about the opportunity for political leaders to increase their presence online through this kind of images. Here you see a critique moved to Salvini by a major Italian rapper, Frankie High Energy. And this is important for what I'm going to say in a moment. Here is one of the examples I'd really like to show you today. A number of photographers in Italy, particularly a collective photographers called Cesura, has been following Salvini and other political leaders over the last few years and producing a number of very significant images that have widely circulated in Italy and not only in Italy. Here you see the cover of Time magazine from September 2018 with the face of Salvini in a picture taken by one of these photographers, whose name is Marco Valli. Salvini was able to reframe this picture and publish it online as a somehow symbol of the success of his reputation internationally, even beyond the fact that the article was harshly critical against Salvini and his policies. But the fact that he was on the cover of Time magazine clearly contributed to this idea. And so what did these photographers do? They produced a huge, a very long project about Salvini, who contributed to the publication of a photographic book called The Captain's Body, Il Corpo del Capitano, whose cover you can see on the right of this slide. So they took the same picture they had originally produced of Salvini, and they used it after the Time event as the cover of their book, but without the eyes, as a mask. So somehow suggesting a strategy of deconstructing its dominant visual forms of self-representation based on color photographs of apparently happy moments among citizens who take a selfie with him, and offering instead a reversed aesthetic language, a black and white, very close and harsh aesthetics focused on the parts of the body and of the gestures of Salvini that come to be isolated and amplified within a very dark and somehow dystopic view of the subject. So this is an example of the increasing symbolic struggles for visual culture hegemony in the field of politics in Italy. Symbolic struggles that have to do with a variety of different practices of media representation, self-representation, and counter-representation. A very final example can be offered by another different sector, always from popular culture in Italy, which is the Festival of Sanremo, which is one of the few very important media events that we still have in Italy. So a music festival which clearly plays a role in terms of national identity construction, in terms of collective belonging, in terms of expressing and sharing a feeling to belong to something bigger than us as citizens together, like many other events in the past, but probably fewer and fewer of them nowadays. So the Festival of Sanremo is an event which is able to somehow freeze and stop Italy for a few days, not just to talk about music, but to talk about Italianness and Italian identity. In 2019, I'm finishing 1 minute, in 2019, a young emerging singer whose name is Mahmoud, and some of you probably will already know him, was the winner of the Festival of Sanremo, somehow unexpectedly, because the popular jury had actually voted for another Italian singer, a very pop singer, whose name is Ultimo. But the jury of the critics and of the press, of the music press, instead decided to have Mahmoud as the winner, so this was a sort of contestation. When Mahmoud won the Festival of Sanremo, a huge debate exploded in Italy for weeks, in which many key institutional figures were involved, even the Prime Minister, key figures from the church, from other different cultural and artistic sectors. Why? Why the winning of a music festival by a young, relatively unknown singer produced such a debate? Because his winning was immediately framed not just as a music issue, but as an identity issue. So Mahmoud was perceived somehow as a sort of innovation in terms of citizenship and visual citizenship in Italy, because Mahmoud clearly is the son of an Egyptian father and an Italian, Sardinian mother, who indeed represents issues of second and third generation of citizenship in Italy. So very hotly debate political issues of citizenship to be given to sons and daughters of migrants in Italy. And some of the issues in which Salvini and many other parties clearly always strikes against. So the fact that he was the winner of the festival indeed produced a number of comments dealing with the identity, his identity, and his role in promoting different and innovative forms of identity recognition and citizenship recognition in Italy. For example, the mayor of Milan, Beppe Sala, wrote, "Bravo Mahmoud, with you, Grattosoglio," the neighborhood from Milan from which he was coming, "the city of Milan and overall Italy is winning today." So it's not just a matter of music or of music quality or of music aesthetics, it's a matter of perceiving in the body of this young singer conflicting tensions regarding issues of citizenship and visual citizenship in Italy. Elisa Esoardi, Matteo Salvini's actually ex-girlfriend, wrote, "Mahmoud has just won the Festival of Sanremo, the demonstration that the meeting of different cultures produces beauty." But Salvini himself, the Prime Minister of Italy, took position on this debate and went online and published this post in which he wrote, "Mahmoud, the best Italian song, I would have chosen Ultimo," the other singer, the second one. "What do you think?" So he took a position against the choice of the juries, but clearly as a way to position himself against the possibility of recognizing issues of citizenship, innovative and visual citizenship in Italy through the media event platform of the Festival of Sanremo. Clearly this generates other debates where many artists, singers, rappers and popular culture figures in Italy took position. A major news magazines published a cover in which he wrote "True Italians, Mahmoud and others, musicians with some Africa in their veins," I'm reading the title, "but born or grew up here in Italy." We have put them together and interviewed to talk about songs and identity cards. I think I will stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much. Thank you very much, Professor Marco, for this so interesting and challenging presentation. I immediately opened the moment for some questions and debates. So, okay.
Thank you very much for this talk. I think it was great. It was a very good overview of the culture, of the field of cultural studies and the relation with visual culture. And I also like the fact that you focus on Stuart Hall and you worked on his legacy and as well as his new revisions of what his relationship with visual culture may be. The intersection between the visual culture, cultural studies, visual culture, and questions of migrancy and migrants is very clear, and it's very important and obvious, and I think you did a wonderful job here. I was wondering if you could also speak about another issue which was very much at heart in the work of Stuart Hall, which is the question of social class. To what extent has social class continued to be represented in cultural studies, and what are the challenges of its representation in visual culture in specific, given that class, unlike questions of, even though it's a transversal issue across different ethnicities, etc., but it's perhaps more difficult to represent. So what are the questions of self-representation and counter-representation regarding class, how can we, are they there in the debate in the cultural studies
Okay,
debate?
thank you. Maybe, Marco, we would listen to all the questions because we only have, I don't know, 5-10 minutes maximum, I think. So I see someone that wants to make it's Professor Rui, okay.
Thank you for your communication. I have 2 questions related. And the first is, do you think that we can place the study of visual culture within scope and objectives of visual rhetoric? And the second, don't you think that there is an absence of reference of rhetoric in cultural study? And if so, what might be the reason for that? Once cultural study proclaims itself to be interdisciplinary. But very rarely we hear speaking of rhetoric in the scope of cultural studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a clarification. You're talking about rhetorics clearly as a field of study. As a field of study, which is recognized in some countries and not in others. Not just as a...
No, it's about a field of study.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there someone more? This is the last opportunity to make a question. Okay. Okay, so, Professor Marco?
Yeah, but the first question, thank you so much to both of you. But the first question is a very complex question that must be somehow historicized in order to answer it, because clearly until the last decades of the last century, social class was a primary reference to any kind of analysis even in cultural studies. British cultural studies emerged by somehow challenging some of the vision of the relationship between class belonging and cultural consumption. Think about the work of Dick Ebditch and subcultures and so on. Over the years, this work, I think, has somehow left, at least in part, the field of cultural studies, but it has acquired a lot of visibility in other fields. For example, in the field of cultural sociology or cultural consumption. Consumption studies have been very strongly involved in studies of social classes, economic inequalities, access, and so on. So more recently, we have seen some work about mainly inequalities, which tried to strike a balance between the issues emerging in the field of culture and consumption theories, consumption studies, and more traditional approach in the field of cultural studies. But in this case, the issue was not just about social classes, but more, I would say, cultural classes or cultural identities again. But it's an important issue because it speaks of a number of areas and topics that are very central in terms of power, structuring power, of our identities, of our practices, and so on, but are very deeply invisible or very hardly visible. And we can name a number of them. Even major complex issues addressing contemporary cultures are basically invisible or very hard to make visible. Migration is an issue, climate change is another issue, organized crime is another issue. You cannot see crime. So we don't have crime, but most of these topics are visible only sometimes in their rare effects. Think about climate change or crime. You see sometimes a scene, a photograph, and you come to realize the presence of something in your society, but very hard to be made more visible and accessible to wider audiences. So I think your question touched upon an issue that I was referring to at the very beginning of my talk, so the need to somehow identify areas of intersection among different traditions and empirical trends in order to be able to exchange even tools and methods and make projects together. Otherwise, we keep talking about interdisciplinary, but then in concrete practice, also for institutional academic reasons, we all tend to go on in our own career and disciplinary fields. Thank you. About the question on rhetorics, I'm not sure if I really got what you were asking. I can say that there are a number of very relevant visual culture scholars nowadays which works mainly on visual rhetorics, and whose work has been very influential. Just to give you an idea, I don't have the slide here. Just to give you an idea, a decade ago there was a major international conference at New York University on visual citizenship, and one of the most debated issues were issues of visual rhetorics. Scholars like, for example, Robert Harriman and John Louis Lucates and others in the US have done incredible work on issues of rhetorics within the field of visual culture. The book, The Public Image, and other books are strongly linked to that tradition of study, but also to that kind of questions. I must say that I tend not to focus too much on questions of composition, structure, design, rhetorical, content of the image, and probably by formation, because I'm a sociologist by formation, tend to focus more on issues of practices, discourses, context, and so on. But clearly, again, these different things must be taken into account together, clearly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to read your paper, because you've presented here as so many challenges, theoretical, epistemological, and even data that we were not really aware of. So thank you very much. I think now we will have a break of 10 minutes.
10, 15 maximum.
15 maximum. And thank you very much. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel.
Professor
Thank you.
Michael. Thank you.